Richard Vedder, welcome to the Inquiring Minds podcast.
Glad to be with you.
Awesome. So let's start by telling the audience a little bit about yourself, what you do, and why you wrote your latest book, Restoring the Promise.
Well, I am a college professor. I've been teaching forever, since you were, no offense, about minus 25, I would guess. I don't know your exact age. But I started in the 60s as a college professor. I'm an economist. I teach at Ohio University, sort of a mid-quality state school. Actually, I'd say a bit above a mid-quality state school, not at the very top of the list, but it's a good quality school, very old school, one of the oldest in the United States. I have been teaching there since the mid-60s. Well, for 35 years, I taught, and I wrote papers and books and so forth in my field, which is economic history. And then as we got around the year 2000, the Wall Street Journal asked me to write a cute little piece for them on the oddities of higher education. And so I wrote, we even use a different language. A year is 12 months for most Americans, but in higher ed, it's usually 9 months. An hour is 60 minutes long, most Americans think, but in higher ed, about 50 minutes, class period's 50 minutes long. In higher ed, sometimes the employees can fire the bosses. That's unheard of everywhere else in the world. Even the Pope can't be fired, but the president of Harvard was fired in 2004 or 5. Larry Summers, more or less fired. Faculty was unhappy with him and censored him, and he was gone. So I said, we're a peculiar institution, higher ed is. And that led me to doing other things. Some people read this story in the Wall Street Journal, and the governor of Virginia thought, gee, that's great. So the governor of Virginia had me down to Charlottesville to talk to the boards of visitors, as they call them in Virginia, the trustees of the various state universities. So I gave a talk to them, and that went over pretty well. So then part of Columbia University has an institute, the Hechinger Institute. They asked me to give a talk. So I kept giving these bigger and bigger talks on higher ed, and I said, oh, the heck with it. I'm just going to write a book about it. So I said, I'll just take a year off and write a book about higher ed. It's kind of fun. I was near the end of my conventional academic career, and I said, this is probably a good time as any to do something different. So I wrote a book on called Going Broke by Degree on college and college costs and why the college costs have grown up so much. And that led to someone who was with a think tank or a charitable organization to say, hey, you ought to start a think tank on this. This is a great topic and you know a lot about it. And this person said, I'll get you some money. So I started, I always respond to incentives, typical
Economist.
Typical economist, typical human being, actually, for that matter. And so I did. And I started a think tank, which I ran for more than a decade. Until I got tired of running a think tank, because that does involve raising money. And after a while, I got tired of it. And I was getting to a point where I said I should go, and sit in a rocking chair at some nursing home somewhere. But I never did that, by the way. I think I'll blow my brains out before I do something like that. I certainly don't want to stay in one of Governor Cuomo's nursing homes in New York State.
Yeah.
Kiss of death. But anyway, so I did all this. And so I got invited after this book came out and after this think tank started by the White House. I guess it was the White House. Officially, the Secretary of Education at the time, Margaret Spellings, to be on a national commission to look at higher ed in America called the Spellings Commission. In the first decade of the 20th century, 2006, 7, this was kind of a big deal. This was the biggest thing going on in higher ed. We're supposed to reform higher ed or come in with recommendations. We had a pretty prestigious group of about 20. I was put on that. So I spent a year going to hearings around the nation on higher ed issues and so forth. And so I just kept forever getting more involved in higher ed. And I couldn't get away from it. I wanted to go back and do some of my other earlier research, but this was a nice gig. And so 3-4 years ago, I thought I ought to update my earlier book. There are a lot of things that happened in the first 20 years of this century. And I had only picked up on the early parts of that. So I wrote the book that you held up called Restoring the Promise. And so I have been spending the last 20 years researching higher ed issues and talking about them. And talk too much about myself, and I'll let you ask questions.
Yeah, no problem. I enjoy when the guest gets to talk more than me because I'm not as interesting. Well, first and foremost, I want to break down the different issues that you outline in your book. So you nicely outline, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 6 to 7 core problems with higher ed. That's the student loan crisis and college athletics. And we're going to go over piece by piece, but let's just start with the most basic question for me. Should everyone go to college? And what should we teach in college?
Yeah, those are, thank you for asking that, by the way. You're a good interviewer. Most people want to go in and say, well, why is tuition costs going up so much? And those are important things, but you ought to start off with the basics, the fundamentals. Why should you go to college in the first place? And or you started to put it a slightly different way, should everyone go to college? That's the related question. And I will answer that last one first. If I have to give a one-word answer, the answer is no. Should some people go to college? Yes, of course. Then the question is, who should go to college? How many should go to college? And how much college should some people? Is there anything magic about a 4-year degree? I mean, how did we come up with 4 years? In Europe, it's 3 years to get a bachelor's. Why not in the United States? Why don't we have a 3-year degree? We have a 2-year associate degree and a 4-year bachelor degree. Why don't we have a 3-year bachelor degree and have kids go to school year round rather than 9 months a year? They're spending the 3 months in the summer picking the crops, I guess. There's some antiquated reason why we take the summer off. So we should do things differently. So I think, what is the purpose of college? When it started out in the United States, 1636 with Harvard, college was sort of to prepare people for good citizenship, or in some cases even for to improve one's virtue and morality. A quarter of the earliest college graduates were ministers, became ministers. They went into the religious professions. And so the early emphasis was on that. Well, that, obviously that didn't last very long. I think, look at today's college students. My best my most favorite college student just left today for Padre Island, wherever the heck that is, off Texas, to party for a week nonstop, no doubt. And I told him not to tell me what he did while he was there, because it'll be all illegal or improper in some way. But so we have originally that sort of motive, and then of course the notion came that colleges are to prepare people for a profession or career, the law, medicine, things like that. And so as time has gone on, and we have become more and more educated. Now and the demands, the credentialization have become greater. The one thing, big thing that happened a little bit along the way was about 100 years ago, Americans decided we should emulate the Germans and have these research universities, which were dedicated to improving mainly science and engineering. And so that was a late 19th century, early 20th century innovation that, of course, has continued to this day. And then around 1910, we added the junior colleges, or the we call them today community colleges, into the mix. And public universities, state universities, where there were no state universities for 200 years. Only around 1800 do we get the really beginning of what we really call public universities. And so the system has kind of grown up. It's kind of a hodgepodge of different things with different goals, different aspirations, different objectives for different people. And there is where we are now, I guess. It's kind of a haphazard answer, but you know, you're not paying me a lot to think.
And as a college professor, have you seen a noticeable decline in the quality of students that you've seen?
I've seen some decline over time. And although I've taught at my university, Ohio University, for 50 years, I've done quite a bit of temporary teaching at other universities, some of them pretty kind of highfalutin, fancy universities, top 25 schools, at least 2 top 25 schools, as well as, you know, all kinds of schools. And my general impression is, well, one thing is very clear. Students don't work as hard as they did 50 years ago at their studies. The evidence is clear on this. And the Department of Labor has something called a time use survey. We have data back to the 1960s. In the 1960s, college students spent 40 hours a week, either in class or studying. The old rule of thumb was for every hour you're in class, you need to study 2 hours outside of class. That was pretty close to what people did back in the old days. And as a student myself during that period, I noted that, and I think that was about right. I mean, an accurate portrayal of what happened at most campuses, not everywhere, of course. Today, the average student spends less than 30 hours a week, maybe 27 hours a week, doing academic things. About half of that's going to class. The other half is writing papers, studying for tests, taking tests, reading assignments, and so forth. There's been an abrupt or a substantial decline in work effort, which I partially attribute, and probably a large percentage of it, is grade inflation. You don't have to work too hard to get a decent grades today. I mean, you have to do some work, which it used to be, you know, you had to put in a respectable amount of work. When I started teaching, the typical grade in a survey course was a C. And my early years of teaching, I would guess a third of my students got below C's, or a quarter of them, D's and F's. And nowadays, a student thinks their constitutional rights have been violated if they get a D or F. D, what's a D? I never heard of that grade. And we give a lot of A's, and so students don't feel compelled to work so hard. So they don't. And this, of course, is true in high school as well. I mean, this doesn't start when they start college. This goes back earlier. So today's college students are a little less prepared. They know a little less. Their grammar isn't as good. We could talk about specific. The one area I think they have not declined as much as mathematics, because we have put greater emphasis on quantitative skills gradually over the last half century, the rise of computers and so forth. Everyone realizes knowledge of understanding quantitative concepts is important. And so maybe the decline's been less in that area. In the area of things like English, or you ask people about historical knowledge, what do you know about the Mayflower Compact? Most people would say, what the heck is the Mayflower Compact? What's he talking about? In 1960 or 1970, every college student knew what the Mayflower Compact is. Today, some of them do, but most of them don't. So I would say there's been, I'm taking too long to answer your question, but the basic answer, see, I'm a college professor and I talk in 50-minute sound bites. When I do an interview for national TV or radio, which I sometimes do, I can give a 15-minute soundbite or 30 seconds. But this format lends itself to long answers. So I apologize if I'm going on too long.
No need to apologize. I think more to your point, I read an article recently in, I think it was Bloomberg, where a very respected historian named Max Hastings, history of Vietnam and a bunch of other histories. He wrote an article outlining the fact that we live in a very historically illiterate country, and we don't teach military history in college. The amount of history, this is personally pertaining to me. I double majored in college in economics and history. So
where did you go?
I went to a CUNY.
Okay.
It was Baruch College. And
that's a good school.
Yeah, and I noticed that too. I noticed a lot of people didn't know history after college, and I feel like we have this arbitrary concept of education where you go to college for 4 years, you get a job, and you stop learning for the rest of your life. I don't think it should be that way. I think people should keep learning and learning and learning.
Sure.
But again, to Max Hastings' point, the fact that we don't teach military history, we don't teach some of these subjects, I feel like that might be maybe a perverse set of incentives on college campuses. But I mean, I'm not on the inside. But I think before we get into the issues in higher ed, I think you touched on it before. What's the role of improving K through 12 education? Because it sounds to me like if you fix higher ed, you're only, it's putting lipstick on a pig in some regard. You're not fixing the entire issue. You're just, you're ignoring the bigger picture in my mind.
You're absolutely right. We just draw an arbitrary distinction that somehow at age 18, you go from being what we call a secondary ed student or a high school student to being a college student. And you go to somehow a different classroom and so forth, and you're now in a different category. And that distinction is a bit arbitrary. And I guess it's inevitable that you will have some arbitrariness in how you define things. But and by the way, I used to serve on a public school board. I was actually an elected member. The dumbest thing I ever did in my life was to serve on a school board. I once got sued uh, by a parent of a student because the student didn't make the cheerleading squad at the local high school. So I mean, this is the kind of stuff I had to put up.
No comment on my end.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, crazy stuff. So uh, we have had a deficient K through 12 education system in the United States, and the problem starts there. Uh, and colleges have to do a certain amount of remedial instruction to catch some students up. Uh, and there is an abysmal ignorance in certain areas. The history area that you mentioned, I think, is particularly important. As America today is, I think some of our problems in America today are pulling apart rather than moving together. Results from a lack of a common knowledge about our shared past experience, and and I think that's the cause of some, not all of our problems, but 10%, 20%, some percent of our problems today as a nation come from increasing ignorance about our past. And there are other, I'm sure we have ignorance in other areas as well. Kids don't know enough math as they should, perhaps, and so on and so forth. But in this area, it's one that I particularly know. Anyway, I'm going to let you ask the questions and give shorter answers.
Yeah, so I think let's just get going on some of the core issues that you outline in your book, and let me start with the student loan crisis, because that's the one we hear about most in the news. And so, what is the cause of the student loan crisis, in your opinion, and how can we fix it?
Well, the cause is we give student loans out. If we didn't have student loans, there'd be no crisis. And I'm sort of half joking, but half serious about this. Uh, this is an area of public policy in the United States that I feel where we have just completely, where the what I call the law of unintended consequences is at work the most. We started the student loan program in the 1960s, the federal student loan program. We had the GI Bill, which was a grant to soldiers from World War II and after, is when the government started getting in the business, of federal government, of giving money out to kids to go to college. But the student loans program, as we know it, mostly dates from the mid 1960s. And it was put in, and being old enough, I can actually remember this. It was put in largely to provide financial assistance to low income kids to meet the cost of college. Well, today, 50 years later, we have a smaller percentage of low income graduates of college as a percentage of those graduating from college than we did 50 years ago. The kids going to college today we don't have a lot more poor kids graduating from college because as the colleges started realizing that the federal government would lend money to students, what did the colleges do? They said, aha, we can raise tuition fees more aggressively than we previously did. So back before the mid 70s, before these student loan programs got very big, tuition fees went up, if I may use a visual aid. I don't know if this appears. I call this West Virginia PowerPoint, by the way. Fees went up about 1% a year more than the overall inflation rate. But now all of a sudden they started going up 3 or 4% more than the overall. inflation rate. Colleges said, we can raise fees more aggressively. The kids will find the money. They'll just borrow more money. And for 30, 40 years, that's what happened. And so when I started teaching at my university, the tuition fee was $450 a year. In today's dollars, maybe $3,000. Now it's 4 times that. And it's true everywhere in the country. It's true in New York, for example. I assume you're in New York. I spent 1 year doing New York universities of various kinds. I did some of the SUNY schools. I did, Fordham and so forth, and NYU. I did the New York City school 1 year. I just said, I'm going to see how many New York City schools I can hit, and before going crazy, did a lot. But the tuition fees went way up, and so in terms of meeting the goal of making college more affordable, I think that it backfired. It didn't have the intended impact, and in fact, it scared away some low-income people going to college, because in order to go, first of all, you have to fill out a federal form called the FAFSA form. Well, that form, being a government bureaucracy, grew to, until very recently, till just right now, it's been over 100 questions long, 120 questions long. You almost need a college degree to fill out the form. My wife for years as a guidance counselor in a low-income school district. None of the kids wanted to go to college because they didn't want to. The parents wouldn't fill out the form. It was too long, too difficult, too many questions, and so we put a lot of barriers in the way of people to go to college. So the student loan programs have been, in my opinion, a failure, and now there are different ways they can be modified, and some of the modifications would allow us to have a student loan program, and it would work better than what we have now. So there are some things can be done, and some other ideas that are about it are things like income share agreements, where students sell a share of their future income. They sell stock in themselves. You want to buy 5% of me? You can buy 5% of me for 10 years. And you give me $50,000, I'll give you 10% of my income for the next 10 years or something, argue what the terms ought to be. And that finance college that way, rather than having 18-year-old kids who don't know anything about borrowing money or anything, go out and borrow $30, $40, $60, $80,000, that they're not, it's something they don't even understand very well. And you're asking them to do that. And so we've had a lot of problems. And that leads to, our current debate about, well, should we forgive these loans? And we could go on forever on this. I want to keep this to an hour.
Well, actually, what would your answer to that be? Should we forgive them?
No, I would say no. And I am unpopular on some quarters, mainly among people who borrowed a lot of money, for saying that. There's a whole variety of reasons. One obvious sort of fairness issue is there are a lot of people, in fact, a majority of people who borrow, pay their loans back. And it would be viewed as very unfair by some of these people who have recently paid off their student loans, after in some cases having sacrificed quite a bit in order to do so, living less comfortably than they otherwise would, driving old cars, not taking fancy vacations, that sort of thing. Who to pay off their loan in, say, 10-year period, for them to be told, well, you were suckers, you paid off your loan. Well, we're going to let the people who didn't pay off their loans, who just let the balances increase or maybe made minimal nominal payments on their loans, we're going to forget those loans. And so there's a real fairness issue that I think is pretty severe. And so that's part of the problem. Also, an interesting thing about people who borrowed a lot, you know who borrowed the most money? Not poor people, they're rich people, or moderately well off. They're people who borrow money to go to law school or to get an MBA from Columbia or NYU, and borrowed $100,000, and they went out and got a job on Wall Street or something, and they're making 125, 150,000, $200,000 a year now, and they say, hey, these loans are kind of cool. The interest rates on them are pretty low, and so they make minimal payments and they live a pretty decent life. And some of them are, paying them off, but the people who have the largest amount of money that they're borrowing are not poor people, low income people. They're high. The data are clear on this. New York Federal Reserve Bank has scads of data on this, and it shows this. So there are a variety of equity and fairness reasons why paying off, just forgiving all the loans would be a bad idea. Now, they're sort of, Obama put in something that is a reasonable idea, I guess, and that is we'll let people pay back a percentage of their income for a certain number of years. And after 20 years, if they haven't paid back the loans, we'll just forgive the rest. There are some problems with that too. It's a better approach than total loan forgiveness, but to forgive. By the way, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars here. We're not talking chump change. Mm-hmm. We're talking a lot of money, and I guess we're sort of in an era where I don't know what people think. I guess money drop. The Federal Reserve is dropping money out of airplanes over people all over, or the federal government is. I mean, people are getting. I talked to one of my students today, who's now first year in law school. He said, I got, I don't know, $1,400, whatever, the other day. And yeah, maybe I'll take a vacation. There was a trip I want to. These are not poverty-stricken people. Some of them are. Some of them are poverty-stricken. I'm not saying there are people in distress, but there is an awful lot of poor targeting of this money. And so here we have a nation with mammoth deficits, mammoth national debt, 20-some billion. The Fed dropping money out of airplanes. I know they would put it another way, but it's the equivalent of it. It's printing money. The money supply went up 28% last year. Unprecedented for a peacetime. Unprecedented, totally. There's got to be inflationary effects of this somewhere along the line, or there's something really weird going on. And the evidence is starting to show inflation starting to creep up a little bit. Interest rates have gone up in the last year or so. The stock market, which has been soaring, is kind of leveled off now. We may be, who knows, ready for a big fall. And the student loan problem is just forgiving hundreds of billions of student loans is questionable on financial grounds. It's an irresponsible move, many would say, and I'm inclined to agree with them.
Yeah, and I think this has led a lot of people, personally, that I've spoken to, and a lot of my friends went to CUNYs as well, so we didn't pay as much as, sure, an NYU, Columbia, or Fordham might. But I think people are now looking for alternatives. So in my opinion, there are a few sides to this issue. There are a lot of prominent people, businessmen, entrepreneurs. Peter Thiel, that you point out in your book, has actually paid people not to go to college, which I don't think is the worst idea in the world. I think it's
kind of cool.
I think it's really cool. Yeah. And people, I've heard numerous claims where you can learn as much watching an online lecture, Khan Academy is a free resource that you can use.
Sure.
We have a lot of access to information, a lot of public lectures from very prominent professors online. You can learn nearly as much just, spending a couple of years investing your time and going on YouTube and watching videos. So I think that's one side. The other side that I've seen personally, and again, I can't, quantify, and I've been taught not to count other people's money, but whenever I went to school, and again, I went to a city school, and um, I saw most of my favorite professors, and I think the best ones I had were adjuncts. They weren't full-time professors. But then you go and you know how much an adjunct gets paid per class. They teach, a lot of them taught 6, 7 classes a semester just to keep, a roof over their head and food on the table. And then you see full-time administrators in universities seemingly doing nothing. I mean, some of them, again, some of them do something, but a lot of them don't serve a purpose. And I think a lot of the problem is the fact that we mismanage the money. I mean, obviously, you outline in your book that, athletics is a big issue where we spend a lot of money on college athletics. Again, not a problem in a Division III school like mine, but for Penn State or a University of Michigan or something like that, that might be a bigger issue. So I think, would you support, for example, providing more tenure tracks to professors so we can incentivize the best professors teaching at universities instead of paying administrators? And two, why is that an issue that nobody seems to want to address?
Well, a lot of faculty want to address it. And by the way, this has been a perennial faculty. I've been in this business forever, 50 years. Even 50 years ago, we complained about administrators. Socrates didn't have any administrators. He didn't have a dean of students to help him teach the youth of Athens. He didn't have a diversity coordinators. He didn't have any of this. There was Socrates and there were the students. That was it. I haven't looked at the composition of the faculty on Plato had an academy. I don't think we have enough data to look it up. But the point is, you're absolutely right. I think there's been enormous administrative bloat in higher ed. 50 years ago, at my university, very typical, 40, 50 years ago, there were about 2 faculty members for every, let's call them administrator. Twice as many faculty as administrators. Now there are more administrators than faculty. Mm-hmm. So if we could go back to the ratio that we had 50 years ago, in my university, that would mean we would get rid of 500, 600 administrators, save $100 million, and we could do lower tuition. We could hire more professors on a tenure track rather than as an adjunct. We could do a whole variety of things with that money, one of which is, along the lines you suggest. By the way, I agree with you, at least in part. I don't know what the empirical evidence would show, but the notion that somehow adjunct professors are bad professors is not always the case. They're often very good. And some of them also bring unique real world experiences to the teaching, which I think is something that us professors, being mostly nerdy, dirty old men and women, don't bring. We're into books and we're not into real life as much. I think the adjuncts bring a perspective that is often valuable. But it is true that there are problems with resource allocation in colleges, lots of them. The buildings are empty most of the time. We waste a lot of money on just buildings. 3 months of the year in the summer, they're in most places in the United States, not everywhere. It's not always true in urban universities as much, but if you go to Penn State, you mentioned Penn State, in the summer, there's hardly anyone in any academic buildings. And that's the way it is where I teach. So we have an enormous amount of waste going on, underutilization. Another thing is faculty, this sort of publish or perish notion that came in big at the research universities, but it's found everywhere. It's found at the SUNY CUNY type schools. It's found at the Columbias and the Harvards and the Michigans and the Berkeleys of the world. But it's also found at, Stony Brook or Binghamton, to put it in a New York context. You've got to publish if you're going to be successful as an academic. And so people in some disciplines are teaching 6 hours a week. 9 hours a week is a high teaching load for a faculty. When I started teaching a zillion years ago, the loads were much higher. The loads have fallen by about a third. Why? Well, we want faculty to do research. Well, what happens to the research? Where is the research? It's in the journal of last resort, some journal that no one reads, 500 people read, and some of that research is maybe cutting edge. Occasionally there will be a really insightful piece and an advancement of knowledge, but most of it's pretty mundane stuff. And for a while, I was tracking this statistic for a while. There were over 20,000 scholarly articles on William Shakespeare written in academic journals over a 20-year period. That's 1,000 articles a year, 3 a day, every 8 hours, Monday, Saturdays and Sundays and holidays included. We had a new paper on Shakespeare. I mean, Shakespeare was a great man. I love Shakespeare, but how much more can we say about the dude? And, I think diminishing return, the concept of economics is applicable here, diminishing returns. So we waste a lot of resources. We waste faculty resources. There's a lot of misallocation of them. We misallocate building resources. You go on any campus on the weekends. There are some places where this isn't the case, but most places the buildings are empty. Late in the afternoon, they're empty. A lot of schools don't want to teach on Fridays anymore. We want to have the kids have a long weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So we build these beautiful palaces with atriums and climbing walls and all this other stuff to try to attract students to come. In the West and South, where the weather is a little warmer, lazy rivers are big these days, which is sort of a fancy kind of swimming pool that are about 500 yards long or something, and where you sit on an inner tube, and the more progressive ones, they have a little place on the inner tube where you can put your beer, so you can sit and contemplate life and drink beer. And that's just that's not what colleges are supposed to be about, or at least, and by the way, I'm all for kids having a good time in college, but we are wasting a lot of resources, bottom line.
Yeah. And I think another big issue, and I think arguably the biggest issue that I noticed in your book, is the issue of academic freedom. And I think a lot of great intellectuals, unfortunately, it seems to be coming from intellectuals that are more right-leaning. They seem to be highlighting these issues. The beginning of what a lot of people would call woke culture. So the trigger warnings, microaggressions, safe spaces. Can you do like a quick overview? Maybe when did this begin to occur, and why did it catch on as much as it did?
Well, that's a good question. And I'm not sure I have the complete answer to it. But I will say, first of all, as a historical note, there were attempts to restrain what people could say and do even 50, 60 years ago. But the interesting thing, a little different about the McCarthy era problems, was most of the cancel culture, if you like, or most of the attempt to restrain expression was uh, directed to people on the left of the political spectrum. It was an anti-communist move. And people were worried about national security issues associated with having communists. And so, for example, the state of California, you had to sign a loyalty oath saying, I love the American government and I'm against communists and so on, before you could teach at the University of California. So there have been various periods in history where we've had constraints on individual freedom of expression. But those have grown enormously. I didn't think they were very great in the 1970s or 80s or 90s. And, I was teaching all during this period. I didn't see that as a big issue in colleges, but it has become an issue in the 21st century. And it's part of the growth of a sort of a new aggressive form of progressivism, I guess you'd call it, and an intolerance of people of other perspectives other than your own. And I argue, and I guess I've got a piece that's coming out next week or in Forbes or somewhere, that argue I think this is the single biggest problem in American universities today. People are afraid to express themselves. And that's what colleges are all about. You want to bring together people. Some of them are a little bit crazy. Arguably, half of them are crazy. You want to bring them together. You want them to argue, and you want to have a marketplace of ideas where you discuss the pros and cons of different perspectives on life. And this leads, in the long run, to some advancement in knowledge and humankind and wisdom. And, it's like, I think Galileo was suppressed for believing that the sun went around the earth rather than the other way around. And, he was tried for this, for the heliocentric theory, astronomical theory. And today we're not exactly trying people in inquisitions, but there are people, and it is, I think, mainly people on the right who feel they're being oppressed, and I think with some validity. And I think this is very, very frightening, and it scares the heck out of me. It has gradually grown over time, and it's still growing. The worst manifestations of it legally, speech codes, trigger warnings, some of that have been shot down by the courts in some cases, and there have been attacks on that. But the overall manifestation of this point of view is very, very strong, and administration's going along with it. One of the problems is the faculty no longer run universities. Used to be universities were run by academics, and the president would be a former professor who happened to be the president of the university, pretty good at administrative things and good at raising money and good in keeping the faculty happy. You give the faculty parking, they're happy. You give the students high grades and let them drink and have sex, they're happy. You do whatever it takes. But nowadays, we have a problem here. Human expression is being curtailed, and the administrations are often going along with it. And the student affairs part of the university, the dean of students office, and all these people are the worst.
Yeah, and again, you mentioned the fact that back in the day, we don't have trials, with guillotines and public executions, but I do feel like we have a tr- trials of public opinion, right? Like
Absolutely.
I've so many friends of mine that were afraid to speak up in college because they might have an opinion that's, if they told you their opinion, you wouldn't think it's radical. They're not saying anything crazy. They just have a slightly different opinion, but they're just afraid to express it. I think I'm not trying to make myself into a martyr or uh, call myself
Sure.
brave, but like, for example, when I decided to start this podcast, my mom said, "Hey, aren't you a little afraid that some employer down the road will see this and go, you know, you, they're gonna just fire you without cause, and but this might be the reason." And I said, "Yeah, look, at the end of the day, you gotta do what you feel is right." I've always liked talking to people with different opinions, and I think that's the only way you can grow. And at the end of the day, I really do feel like this is a very loud minority of people that are causing the big problems on college campuses. So I'm not too worried about it, nor should I think most people shouldn't be worried. Uh, I know we're a little pressed for time. We could go a little over an hour. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but uh, let me, since we touched a little bit on the um, free speech issues and all that, I do want to. Uh, I'd regret if I didn't ask this question of an economist. What do you? This is a completely different topic, by the way. Um, what is your position on the minimum wage hike? And
Wow, you are really switching gears.
yeah, I really wanted to do that because
Yeah.
I'm very interested in the topic, and it's I do want to know both sides, and
Yeah.
I have an economist, so here.
Well, I have not only opinions about it, I've written quite a bit about it. I'm a labor economics is a large part of my work has been in that area. So I've, done quite a bit of work relating to wages. Uh, Actually, my most famous book, which was published, by the way, by the NYU Press, uh, uh, deals with that topic, the relationship between wages and unemployment. And uh, when you bring up the subject of minimum wages, that brings me, I think, first of what Milton Friedman once said. Milton Friedman was one of the most distinguished economists of the 20th century, died early in this century, 2006, I think. And he once said when the word Negro was used to refer to what we generally call Black people or African Americans today, he once said the minimum wage is the most anti Negro law on the books. And what he meant was that minimum wages force employers to pay more than for workers than they're worth in some cases, more than they're adding to the firm's revenue. So they have to let some workers go if you raise the minimum wage a lot. And in fact, I did a study that showed that 100 years ago, in the middle of Jim Crow world, where there was ranked racial discrimination against blacks, no question about it, the unemployment rate among blacks in 1930 was about the same as among whites, or in the year 1900. And then today it's almost twice as high among blacks as whites. Well, why is that? Well, minimum wages, let's say we had a $15 minimum wage. Uh, In some employers, fast food places, for example, who have a lot of teenage workers making $9, $10 an hour, $8 an hour. In New York, they probably make a little more, but in the South and in low wage areas, maybe $8 an hour. If you start saying you're going to pay $15, you have to pay $15. A lot of those places would close down. A lot of workers would lose their jobs. And they're going to be mainly people who are marginally skilled. And that is disproportionately teenagers, minorities, and the like. So there's no question that the cost of the minimum wage, it feels good to have a high minimum wage, but it imposes a cost on society, and that cost is pretty high. Well, if we raise the minimum wage from $7.25, which is admittedly a pretty low wage, to $8 an hour, is it going to have much impact? Not really, because there's very few people making less than $8 an hour anyway. But if we raise it to 15 an hour, yeah, you may start having big effects, particularly in low wage areas. But why stop at 15? Why not go to 25? Why not go to 25 an hour? And we're in the age of big expansion. We're dropping money out of airplanes these days, doing other things, writing $1,400 checks to people, some of whom who desperately need the money, others who do not. Why don't we just raise it to 2025? And the answer is it's because it's going to cause a lot of unemployment. It's going to cause a lot of people losing their job. I rather let markets kind of determine wages. If there are people who are undercompensated or who are having trouble living, there's other ways you can compensate them. There's other ways you can provide help with. We have things like food stamps or SNAP benefits and so forth, housing subsidies, a whole variety of transfer payments. Directly impacting wages, I think, is a less efficient way to go. So I tend to be sort of negative on this. It'll be interesting to see what happens. The bloodshed that we're going to go through in Washington in the next 6 months is going to be something to behold, I predict. By the way, I used to work for Congress, so I have, even though I'm an academic, I have some real world political experience. And I worked for the US Congress for a while, and I've testified dozens of times before congressional committees. And I just think we're going to be in for a big brouhaha over this issue. Well, time will tell.
Yeah, and let's just, I guess, let's just close out this conversation. Let me ask two more questions. So the first one is, you mentioned the Biden administration, radically different in some ways than the Trump administration. What gives you hope for the future in terms of education policy, issues like the minimum wage? What keeps you hopeful? What keeps you, getting up in the bed in the morning and saying, it has to get better?
Well, I have been rather pessimistic lately. I told my wife we were going to move to the Turks and Caicos, and because they have no income tax there, and the weather's nice, except every 20 years a hurricane comes along and blows the whole place away. And I said, I'm old enough that maybe we'll live through it before the next hurricane comes. So I'm sort of half joking, but
doesn't Texas not have an income tax either?
Yeah, Texas doesn't, Florida doesn't. There are a lot of places that don't.
Ohio has good, I think it's decent,
We're
right?
middle road on that. Yeah, no. Why is everyone leaving New York and moving to Florida or Texas? That's the reason. That's not the only reason, but it's an important part.
Yeah.
So I think that's a problem. So on the other hand, America does have, I'm an economic historian, and in the past, we have shown an enormously adaptive capacity to respond to challenges and to threats And even, even 9/11, everyone said, oh God, the world's falling apart when they bombed the World Trade Center. And it was a horrible thing and everything. But we haven't had any major problems of that nature since, because we responded fairly decisively as a nation. And, we went in and we let the people, some people know that they have to pay a price when they attack the United States. Similarly, this has been true throughout history. And I think we have the capacity to respond to this. There's technology and new things. If the colleges become increasingly inefficient and anarchistic and refusing to make changes, people will say the heck with the colleges, and they'll get. Already, we have people going to coding academies and things like that, and they're learning that, hey, there's other ways besides a four-year college where we can develop the Peter Thiel you mentioned, other ways where we can develop. So I have some sense that American ingenuity and will come through, and we will overcome these obstacles and legal obstacles. Things like, for example, tenure, which I think on the whole has been a pretty good thing. Does have some inefficiencies associated with it. It's going away. The percentage of professors with tenure are declining. So there's changes going on that probably in the long run will be okay, maybe even for the good. So I'm sort of cautiously optimistic about the long run. But as John Maynard Keynes once said, another economist, in the long run, we're all dead. So that's not a very nice note to end the conversation with, but it's one that is there. So
yeah, and again, last question. I promise
sure.
this is something I'm going to keep across.
This is okay.
Yeah, I'm going to keep across the board with all my guests. What are 5 books that you would recommend to any person? Doesn't have to be in your field. 5 books across the board.
Oh wow. I read a lot of history, but I also read a lot of semi-trashy mystery novels that I enjoy and things as well. Boy, you caught me off guard, Stanley, with that one. Totally off guard. And I'm reading right now a biography of Margaret Thatcher. It's 3 volumes long. It's 2,300 pages long, which in my mind is a bit too much. But there was a remarkable human being. I like to read books about remarkable human beings. There was a book out last year, so it's not.
Andrew Roberts, Churchill, if that's what
Andrew Roberts wrote a great Churchill book, and there's a book called The Splendid and the Vile, which was written by
Eric Larson.
Great book, I thought. I mean, whether it's 100% true or not, I don't know. But 1 year in the life of Winston Churchill between May 1, 1940 and April 30th of 1941. Well, that was one heck of a year in British history. And there was a man who, through his rhetoric and his genius and his failings, did so much. And the capacity of human beings to make a difference. That book, and Roberts in general, and I like all the great book. There's a lot of other history books, but those are a couple. And I'm going to cut it off there because if I don't, my wife will withhold dinner from me. It's a little early for it, but I better get home to it.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you for asking me.
Yeah, I appreciate your time. Thank you.
I hope you're building a listenership or a viewership, and good luck to you.
Thank you very much. Richard Vedder.
Thanks.
Thank you.